What if I told you the most powerful queen in British history smelled like a rotting corpse, and her teeth were blackened by sugar, not because she was dying, but because that was royal hygiene? This is the story of Queen Elizabeth I, the virgin queen who ruled an empire and lived in filth behind the palace walls. Would you survive a single day in the Tudor court without deodorant, toothpaste, or running water? Comment below. The portraits lied. The grand oil paintings of Queen Elizabeth I show a pale, pristine goddess draped in pearls and radiating poise, wisdom, and glory. But beneath the white lead makeup was a woman who hadn't washed in weeks, a woman whose breath reeked of decay, whose wigs were crawling with lice, and whose body was coated in layers of powder meant to cover the smell. The golden age of England sparkled on the surface, but behind the throne there was rot. There was no plumbing in the Tudor era, no toothpaste, no soap in the modern sense. And Elizabeth, despite her power and wealth, was a product of her time. In fact, she embodied the worst of its habits. She famously claimed she bathed once a month, whether I needed or not. But even that was an exaggeration. Her bath was not a relaxing soak. It was a shallow basin of perfumed water, barely enough to wet her feet, and even that only happened under pressure. Physicians of the era warned against full immersion in water, believing it could open the skin to disease. As a result, dirt was not scrubbed away. It was covered up, and Elizabeth covered it with layers upon layers of lead-based white paste, which over time cracked her skin, caused permanent damage, and had to be applied even thicker to hide the damage it caused. This makeup wasn't elegant, it was poisonous. Her ladies-in-waiting noted that under the makeup, her skin turned gray and papery, and when it was peeled off, it often took pieces of flesh with it. Her teeth were another horror. Elizabeth had a notorious sweet tooth, indulging in candied fruits, sugar pastes, and wine-laced syrups. There were no toothbrushes, only coarse cloths or sticks dipped in honey or abrasives. Over the years, her teeth rotted until they turned black, and many fell out entirely. Foreign ambassadors described her speech as difficult to understand, her mouth sunken and foul-smelling. She refused dental treatment, fearing the pain, and instead used spices and flowers to mask the odor. But the smell was still overwhelming. Even her courtiers sometimes backed away mid-conversation. Then there were her clothes. In Tudor England, laundry was a luxury and a risk. Washing fine garments could destroy them, so instead of cleaning dresses, Elizabeth simply rotated them. She had thousands. Many were only aired out, not washed. Some gowns were worn repeatedly, even during the summer heat. Layers of sweat, perfume, powder, and body oil built up inside the silk and velvet, which were often stiff with residue. Her underclothes were rarely changed unless visibly soiled, and the rush-covered palace floors she walked across, littered with rotten food, rodent droppings, and the spillage of chamber pots emptied too late. The air inside the palace was so thick with odor that visitors described a sweet rot, the combined scent of perfume, decay, and mildew. Elizabeth's wigs were also a hygiene disaster. She wore red or golden wigs to project youth, especially after smallpox left her bald in patches. These wigs were not cleaned, only powdered and perfumed. They absorbed sweat and attracted lice, which was common even among nobility. Her scalp underneath, rarely treated, it itched, bled, and in later years developed sores. She reportedly refused to let anyone see her without a wig, even in her final days. Her fingernails were often blackened by dirt. Her court used scented gloves to hide the smell of unwashed hands. And yet, despite all this, or perhaps because of it, Elizabeth projected power through image. The stink was hidden under roses. The rot was masked by lead. The decay was disguised as divine. Her hygiene wasn't just disturbing, it was a metaphor for her reign. beautiful from a distance, deadly up close. She ruled a kingdom but lived in a shell of illusion, every inch of her body a performance, a lie baked into skin, stitched into silk, soaked into every throne she sat on. She was the queen of an empire, and the prisoner of a body in slow, stinking collapse. It's hard to imagine that the woman who gave some of the most powerful speeches in English history, who stared down threats from Rome, Spain, and even her own parliament, could barely move her mouth without wincing. But that was the tragic truth behind Queen Elizabeth I's famous oratory. By the end of her reign, every word she spoke came from a mouth decaying in slow, painful silence. And it all began with the thing she loved most: sugar. In the Tudor era, sugar wasn't just a luxury, it was a status symbol. Only the wealthiest had access to it, and Elizabeth indulged heavily. Candied fruits, sugar syrups, and sweetened wines weren't just treats. They were political displays. Guests at court would be served elaborate sugar sculptures shaped like ships, castles, and even entire banquets recreated in crystalline form. But the queen didn't just display sugar, she consumed it in frightening amounts. She mixed sugar into herbal tonics, added it to meat sauces, and even dipped cloth into sugar paste and rubbed it across her gums as a primitive toothbrush. Yes, her version of dental care involved rubbing sugar onto her teeth. It sounds absurd, but this was the prevailing belief at the time, that sugar, because of its luxury and purity, could clean the mouth of evil vapors. But all it did was invite rot. Slowly, invisibly, the sugar worked its way beneath her enamel, decaying the teeth from within. Ambassadors who met her in person often noted the state of her mouth. Some said her teeth were black as coal, others that they were missing entirely from one side. As the years went on, her dental problems became so severe that she reportedly refused all dental procedures, fearing pain and infection. Dentists in her time used pliers without anesthesia. Bleeding, nerve exposure, and infection were common. One court source described a moment when Elizabeth had to pause during a state speech because blood began leaking from her gums. Eventually, her jaw began to recede. Some historians believe abscesses or dental fistulas may have formed in her mouth, leaking pus into her throat. Her breath was described as death sweet, a mixture of rot and perfume. She chewed cloves to hide the smell, stuffed dried flowers in her mouth, and drank rose water by the mouthful, not as a cosmetic, but as a desperate attempt to rinse out the decay. In private, she became increasingly sensitive about her appearance. Mirrors were removed from her rooms. She limited audiences with foreign dignitaries. She even forbade certain portraits from being painted after the 1580s, insisting that all royal images be based on an ideal face pattern rather than her real appearance. And her teeth, or what was left of them, played a central role in that fear. She knew that a monarch must look immortal, unblemished, untouchable. But behind the fan, behind the powdered lips and the closed-mouth smiles, was a jaw collapsing in real time. By the time of her death, Elizabeth may have had fewer than half her teeth. She spoke less, she smiled less, and the woman who once dazzled Europe with her speeches and presence became a ghost in her own court, present but silent, hiding not just age or illness, but the horrifying consequences of the very luxury she embodied. Sugar made her royal, sugar made her rot, and nobody dared tell her the truth. Because in the court of Queen Elizabeth, even death had to wait its turn, and rot had to wear a crown. Imagine standing in front of a mirror every morning, staring at your own decaying skin, and responding not with medicine, but with poison. That was Queen Elizabeth I's reality, the symbol of royal purity, the Virgin Queen, the living embodiment of England's power. was slowly killing herself with every stroke of her brush, because behind the illusion of beauty lay the most disturbing of all her hygiene habits. She painted her face, and sometimes her chest, arms, and hands with a thick white paste made of lead, vinegar, and egg whites. It was called Venetian ceruse, and it was the deadliest cosmetic ever used in Europe. But to Elizabeth, it was salvation. After surviving smallpox in 1562, the queen was left with deep scars and pockmarks across her cheeks and forehead. In an age when women's worth was directly tied to their beauty, Elizabeth saw her wounds not as a mark of survival, but as a disfigurement that had to be hidden at all costs. And so, she turned to the paste. It started with small dabs on the cheeks and chin, but as time passed, and as the makeup itself damaged her skin further, she needed more to cover the damage it caused. The paste was made by soaking lead in vinegar until it formed a white, chalky substance. This was then mixed with egg whites or rose water into a thick cream. The lead entered her bloodstream through the skin. It caused anemia, muscle weakness, neurological damage, tremors, paranoia, and eventually cognitive decline. But none of that was known at the time. All that mattered to Elizabeth, and to the court, was that she looked pale. In the Tudor mindset, paleness meant nobility. A tan meant you worked outdoors. Pale skin meant wealth, refinement, and high birth. Elizabeth's whiteness became a political symbol. Her entire image, the Gloriana myth, was built on this ghostly glowing visage. But beneath the illusion, her face was a battlefield. Over time, the lead dried her skin until it cracked. And then, as painful sores opened on her cheeks and jawline, she continued to apply more paste. Servants reported seeing her face bleed during long events. Historians believe some of her open wounds became ulcerated, possibly infected. Yet the more pain she felt, the thicker she applied the paint, because to stop was to show weakness, and to Elizabeth, weakness was death. The paste hardened over her skin, forming a porcelain mask. This mask became the face of power. The face printed on coins, stitched into tapestries, painted on royal walls. But it was a lie. The real face of Elizabeth, beneath the layers, was blistered, bleeding, fragile, and toxic. Sometimes she would leave the makeup on for days at a time, reapplying layers on top. At night, it was removed with mercury, another deadly metal. This caused even more damage. Her pores were blocked, her immune system weakened, and the mercury-lead combination poisoned her blood. And yet, she never stopped. Even as her health declined in her 60s, even as her hair fell out in patches, even when her gums bled and her eyesight blurred, she doubled down, insisting on more powder, more paste, more illusion. Her ladies-in-waiting were forbidden to speak of the damage. She covered her neck with high ruffs. She wore gloves to hide the blisters on her hands. And by the end of her reign, she wore wigs, false teeth, and gloves so heavily powdered they left white marks on the objects she touched. It wasn't just vanity, it was armor. Elizabeth ruled as a woman in a man's world. Her legitimacy was constantly under attack, from Catholics, from Parliament, from suitors and enemies who claimed a woman could not lead. Her makeup became more than beauty. It was a defense mechanism, a mask not of fragility but of control, and yet it was eating her alive. Toward the end of her life, Elizabeth became paranoid. Some historians believe the lead and mercury exposure caused neurological symptoms. She became forgetful, suspicious, withdrawn. In 1602, after the death of her close friend the Countess of Nottingham, she reportedly stood in her chambers for hours, refusing to sleep or eat. She refused to be seen without her makeup, even by doctors. She had all mirrors removed from her rooms. She spoke only in whispers, and still, she applied the white paste. Still, she insisted on the mask. Even in death, she was dressed and painted to look youthful, the portrait of a goddess, not a woman poisoned by her own reflection. Venetian ceruse was banned decades later. It was eventually proven to cause infertility, madness, and death. But for Elizabeth, it had already written itself into her legend. Her face was never meant to be real. It was a myth, a mask that ruled a nation, and no one, not even she, could ever take it off. By the final years of Queen Elizabeth III's life, her body was no longer her own. It belonged to the performance, to the crown, to the mask, to the myth she had built stroke by stroke with poisonous lead. Her skin had cracked, her gums bled, her teeth had turned to ruins, but still she applied powder. Still she painted over infection. Still she smiled through pain. Yet beneath the painted face, beneath the lace collars and velvet cloaks, another layer of horror festered, one even closer to her flesh, the royal garments that had become her second skin. Because if Elizabeth was determined to hide her face behind a mask of beauty, she was equally determined to hide her body beneath silk and linen, even if it meant wearing the same undergarments for weeks on end, no matter the heat, the stench, or the filth. This wasn't laziness. This was status. In the 16th century, laundry was not simply inconvenient. It was dangerous, destructive, and expensive. Washing delicate fabrics involved soaking them in lye, urine, or harsh ash soap, then pounding and stretching them until they dried. Repeated washes damaged the threads. Stains were permanent. Fading was irreversible. To preserve royal garments, Elizabeth avoided washing them, even the ones that touched her skin. Instead, she layered them. It was common for noble women to wear 4 to 6 layers beneath their gowns. A shift undergarment, petticoats, farthingales, bodices, sleeves, and outer gowns. These layers weren't breathable. They were heavy. Some included whalebone hoops, wooden stays, or stiffened panels to hold the shape of the queen's silhouette. And yet, Elizabeth wore them daily, for court audiences, for banquets, for hours of standing beneath heavy wigs and jewelry. In the winter, the layers may have helped retain heat, but in the summer, they turned her body into a sweating furnace of fabric, trapping odor, bacteria, and sweat. Yet even then, she refused to change her shift daily. Servants recorded that her undergarments were often unchanged for multiple days, even during heat waves or periods of illness. When she did remove them, they were sometimes stiff with dried sweat, stained yellow at the collar and sleeves, and gave off what one servant described as a sharp and bitter scent. But no one dared complain. To mention the queen's smell was to risk dismissal, or worse, accusation of treasonous insult. Even medical attendants had to work in silence, knowing the layers they helped remove were more toxic than the queen's words. Changing clothes was also a ceremonial affair. Elizabeth's wardrobe was supervised by a mistress of the robes, and each dressing was an event, documented, regulated, observed by attendants. Every gown had symbolic meaning. Purple meant power, black, authority, white, purity. But hygiene? That wasn't the priority. The clothes were spot cleaned, sometimes aired out over smoke or misted with perfume. But most were simply rotated. She had over 2,000 dresses by some accounts, yet it wasn't the outer garments that absorbed the worst of her bodily decay. It was the inner ones, and she wore them until they could no longer be ignored. Her shoes were another matter. Elizabeth reportedly refused to wear open shoes, even in the hottest weather. Her feet were often swollen, blistered, and raw from hours of standing. Silk stockings were worn for warmth and fashion, but were rarely washed. Her feet would swell from the heat trapped by the layers, sometimes giving off sores or fungal infections. But still, she endured it. Still, she hid it. Because appearance was everything. A queen was never supposed to be human, and humans sweat, humans stink, humans bleed. But a queen? A queen had no body. A queen was a symbol, and Elizabeth had built herself into a statue, one that smelled like a tomb. Some visitors described the odor of the court not as filthy, but as sickly sweet. The overuse of perfume, oils, scented gloves, dried herbs sewn into corsets and pouches. All these efforts to mask the queen's rotting wardrobe only made the smell worse. It was described as the scent of a rose wilting on meat. Even the palace itself suffered. The stone walls trapped air. The rush mats on the floors, meant to absorb spills, also trapped urine, wine, food, and body fluids. Combined with Elizabeth's layers of filth-cloaked garments, the result was suffocating, and still, no one complained, because she was not just a woman in dirty linen. She was the Virgin Queen, God's chosen monarch, and in a court obsessed with loyalty, with myth, with pageantry, the smell of power was accepted, even when it stung the eyes. In her final years, the layers became her prison. Weakened by age and sickness, Elizabeth needed help dressing. She struggled to move her arms, to climb stairs, to stand without leaning, yet she refused to remove the layers that weighed her down. When her doctors begged her to bathe, she refused. When they asked to treat her skin, she insisted she was fine. She feared that removing the layers would reveal how far the rot had gone. She wasn't wrong. The day she died, it took hours to peel away the garments. What they found underneath, historians never fully described, but some whispered it was not a body but a husk, with skin worn thin, soaked in perfume, and sealed in history's most beautiful cage. She was Elizabeth Regina, the queen who ruled the seas, defeated the Spanish Armada, and ushered in England's golden age. But beneath it all, she was also a woman decaying inside her own clothing, too proud to change, too powerful to be corrected, too afraid to be seen. By the end of Queen Elizabeth III's reign, her very body had become a fortress, not of strength, but of fear. Layers of silk clung to her decaying skin, lead paint hid her blisters, perfume masked the rot, and still her image was ironclad, untouchable, divine, immortal. But beneath the gowns and behind the mask, there was one fear that haunted Elizabeth even more than aging, and it shaped her most disturbing hygiene habit of all. She refused to bathe, not out of laziness, not from arrogance, but because the greatest doctors in England told her the one thing that could clean her might also kill her. Water, they believed, was dangerous. In the 16th century, medical science was not just primitive, and it was fatal. The leading theory of disease was the humoral system, an ancient belief that health depended on the balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Illness was thought to arise when one of these was out of balance, and bathing was believed to disturb this delicate internal order. Worse, doctors warned that hot water could open the skin's pores, letting evil vapors enter the body. Cold water, on the other hand, could shock the humors, causing fever, palsy, or even death. And so, Queen Elizabeth was advised, by the best minds of her court, to avoid full-body bathing as much as possible. And she listened. In fact, she once famously declared that she bathed once a month, whether I needed or not. But even that was an exaggeration. Most of her baths weren't baths at all. They were rituals of minimal contact. A small basin would be filled with lukewarm rose water or herb-infused wine, and her attendants would gently dab her hands, feet, and perhaps her face with a cloth. No scrubbing, no soap, no rinsing. Just scented cloth dabs meant more to freshen the royal aura than actually remove dirt. Her back, arms, chest, legs, all areas covered in sweat, powder, oils, and waste, were rarely touched, Instead, layers of new perfume and powder were applied to the unwashed skin. Over time, this formed a thick crust of cosmetics and grime, and underneath, her pores suffocated. Elizabeth's skin broke out in rashes, boils, and open sores, especially in her final decades. But her physicians blamed the stars, bad dreams, or imbalance of the blood, never the filth. Bathing was reserved only for emergencies, and even then, done with hesitation. On rare occasions, she allowed a slightly larger basin to be brought into her chamber filled with wine, milk, or floral water. But even then, she never submerged her full body. She feared that water, especially if it had been exposed to air too long, could soften the brain or weaken the nerves. And who could blame her? Public bathhouses had long been outlawed in England due to their association with plague and immorality. Many believed they were breeding grounds for disease. Others claimed evil spirits could inhabit water and enter through the skin. In this world of superstition and pseudoscience, Elizabeth's fear wasn't unusual. It was expected, but for a queen, the consequences were extreme. Her unbathed body became a source of constant maintenance and damage control. Her maids were tasked with brushing dried sweat off her underarms. They applied crushed pearl powder and ambergris oil to cover odors. Her hair, when it grew back in patches after her smallpox illness, was never washed, only brushed and powdered, and when it fell out again, she simply covered it with wigs. Her wigs, too, were never cleaned, only aired out or replaced. The result was that every part of her body existed in a layer of untreated decay, slowly collapsing under its own weight. But even as her health declined, even as she aged into her 60s and her skin could no longer hold the paste, she clung to the belief that bathing was worse than filth. The people around her suffered as well. Servants in the royal chamber were known to faint from the smell during long ceremonies. Courtiers wrote letters describing the thick and foreign air of her inner rooms, but nobody dared speak directly of it. To do so was not only a personal insult, it was an attack on the crown. Because Elizabeth wasn't just a monarch, she was a religion, a symbol of divine right. And divine beings don't bathe, they don't sweat, they don't bleed, they simply glow, even if the light is rotting from within. In her final years, the lack of bathing took a visible toll. Her legs swelled, her joints stiffened, her skin thinned and tore easily. Sores on her back and arms sometimes leaked fluid that soaked through her linen, but she still refused water. Doctors begged her to allow cleansing treatments. She rejected them. When asked to consider herbal baths for her feet, she called it weakness. When told it might relieve her pain, she accused them of trying to poison her. This paranoia, fueled by mercury exposure, aging, and chronic pain, only deepened her resolve, and so she died as she lived, powdered, perfumed, and paralyzed by filth. Even in death, her attendants were ordered to handle her body delicately. Some records suggest her body was so coated in unwashed cosmetics and fabric that it had to be carefully peeled apart, layer by layer. And yet, when her body was laid out for public viewing, she appeared as she always had, pale, majestic, untouchable. No one saw the blisters, no one smelled the infection, no one questioned the myth, because the queen was never just a woman. She was a mask built on fear, a fear that water could kill, and that truth was too filthy to face. In the end, she was not defeated by her enemies, her rivals, or even her age. She was defeated by the one thing she had spent a lifetime avoiding, herself. By the time Queen Elizabeth I had grown old, her body had become a walking battlefield of poisons, sores, sweat, and superstition. She feared water more than war. She hid rot with powder. She endured the stench of her own garments rather than risk a wash, but nowhere was her decaying reality more symbolic and more contagious than in the crown upon her head, because while her subjects saw her wigs as signs of youth, power, and divine strength, few realized that beneath those golden locks lived colonies of lice, crawling in silence, breeding under velvet and lace. And worse still, those wigs weren't always hers alone. In the Tudor court, where status depended on appearance and hygiene was misunderstood or ignored entirely, wigs, headpieces, and royal robes were often shared between noblewomen. Even the queen's most intimate garments, once worn, might be passed down, rotated, or borrowed for ceremony. This was not only unhygienic, it was horrifying. Elizabeth's hair had fallen out in patches after her near-fatal battle with smallpox in her late 20s. At first, she attempted to disguise the damage with creative hairstyles and veils, but over time, her hair loss became too extensive to hide, so she began wearing wigs, thick, elaborate constructions of horsehair, human hair, silk threads, and stiffened cloth. These were powdered white, tinted red, or styled into regal designs that added inches to her height and majesty. To the court, these wigs were symbols of command, but behind the scenes, they were breeding grounds. Wigs were rarely cleaned. There was no system for sanitation. Once used, they were either repowdered and stored or handed off to attendants to be refreshed. Refreshing usually meant brushing off visible dust and lice, dousing it in perfume, and adding more powder to cover odor. But the lice, they remained, and they thrived in the warmth of hair, powder, and oil. Elizabeth had dozens of wigs, but like her gowns, she rotated them, not based on cleanliness, but ceremony and occasion. When wigs were removed, they were placed on wooden forms or cloth mannequins, where lice and nits could remain dormant for days. Attendants who helped with her daily dressing often shared combs, brushes, and pins between wigs, spreading the infestation from one to the next. The queen wasn't alone. Noblewomen who lacked their own access to expensive wigs were sometimes granted the honor of wearing one of Elizabeth's cast-offs during balls or ceremonies. These borrowed pieces were not sanitized, merely scented and pinned, and so the same lice that burrowed into the queen's scalp could find new homes in the powdered curls of her ladies. It was a chain of elegance hiding filth, a royal tradition that passed parasites along with power. Her robes, too, were part of this ecosystem. Royal gowns were stitched from silk, velvet, and brocade, magnificent but heavy and difficult to clean. Many were worn over and over, then stored or lent out. Some were even used for dressing statues of the Virgin Mary or mannequins during courtly presentations. In one documented instance, a noblewoman fell ill shortly after wearing one of the queen's previously used robes. It was dismissed as coincidence, but letters between ladies-in-waiting often hinted at the itch, a quiet reference to lice, mites, or skin infections picked up after wearing royal fabrics. The queen herself was not spared. In her later years, Elizabeth was frequently seen scratching beneath her wig line. One ambassador recorded seeing her flinch as a servant adjusted her hairpiece, noting that Her Majesty's crown stirs too much. Whether he meant it literally or poetically is unclear, but to those who saw her up close, it was known. The crown crawled. Servants tasked with dressing her head often wore gloves and used long pins to adjust her wigs without touching the scalp. Some reportedly burned their gloves after sessions, but again, none dared speak of it openly. To suggest the queen had lice was not a statement of hygiene. It was treason. And so the ritual continued, unbroken, day after day. A dirty scalp, covered with powder, sealed with hair that once belonged to horses or strangers, now laced with living insects, then cloaked in perfume, stiffened with starch, and placed upon a throne. The lice were never mentioned, but they were part of court life, as real as the politics, the poison, and the fear. What made this even more disturbing was how closely these parasites mirrored Elizabeth's rule. Like her monarchy, they were hidden under layers of ceremony. Like her makeup, they thrived in secrecy. And like her authority, they spread silently, through touch, through inheritance, through silence. By the end of her reign, Elizabeth was more costume than woman. The wigs grew larger, the robes heavier, the powder thicker, the lies deeper. Her court bowed to a myth, and yet, beneath it all, her scalp bled and itched, her body sagged, and her hair, what was left of it, clung to a scalp riddled with sores. In death, her wigs were removed. The lice were likely burned along with her funeral garments, but in life, they were part of her, as loyal as any servant, as constant as the crown, and as invisible as the truth she refused to show the world. Because for Queen Elizabeth I, image wasn't just power, it was survival, even if it meant sharing lice with every woman who touched her throne. By the time Queen Elizabeth I entered her 6th decade, her court had become a theater of illusion. Her face was white with poison, her body wrapped in layers of sweat-soaked linen. Her wigs, infested with lice, clung to a bleeding scalp, yet none of it was ever acknowledged, because the most powerful woman in the world had mastered a skill far greater than conquest or diplomacy, the ability to smell like rot and still be worshipped. And in that lie, she invented one of her most peculiar and disturbing hygiene rituals, creating her own primitive deodorants using a combination of crushed pearls, burned eggshells, dried flowers, and ashes. It may sound like superstition, but in the 16th century, the science of scent was a world of fear. Odor wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. The belief of the time was that disease traveled through miasmas, or foul air. If something smelled bad, it was thought to carry death. And so, rather than clean the body, people focused on masking the body. This is where Elizabeth's cosmetic alchemy came into play. With the help of her apothecaries and alchemists, she ordered the creation of powders and pastes designed not to prevent sweating, but to overpower its scent. The base of these powders often included crushed pearls, which were ground to a fine dust and mixed with eggshell, ash, vinegar, and sometimes dried rose petals or lavender. Applied beneath the arms, between the thighs, under the breasts, and along the neckline, these concoctions did not prevent sweat. Instead, they formed a layer of perfumed crust, sticky in heat, abrasive on the skin, and often toxic over time. Pearls, though luxurious, are composed of calcium carbonate, essentially chalk. When applied to damp skin, they turn to paste. Combined with vinegar or wine, the mixture burned on open sores and clogged the pores entirely, but Elizabeth believed it protected her, that it stopped the miasmas, that it saved her life. She often applied multiple layers of this deodorant in one day, especially during court sessions or summer events. Her servants documented entire trays of powders prepared each morning, many with custom scents. Musk, ambergris, from whale intestines, violets, and even crushed cloves were added to try and tame the rotting air. Yet no matter how much she applied, the sweat kept coming. And worse, the paste would break down over time, mixing with oils, filth, and powder to form a rancid slurry under her garments. But still, she refused to stop. Elizabeth believed, as her doctors told her, that washing away the powders could damage the skin and weaken the body. Instead, new powder was simply pressed on top of the old. Her armpits, in particular, became a site of chronic irritation. Records from her later years mention redness and swellings beneath her arms. This may have been a form of contact dermatitis or even fungal infection, made worse by her refusal to clean. But Elizabeth did not treat it with rest or bathing. She treated it with more powder, with more crushed pearls, with more ash. Even her gloves were scented. She wore them at all times, in public, sometimes pressing them to her nose as she passed courtiers, not to avoid the smell of others, but to avoid letting them smell her. Gloves were soaked in oils of rose, cinnamon, and lavender, but beneath them, her hands were rarely washed. Fingernails turned black from trapped dirt and powder. When she lifted her hand to wave, it was a symbol of royalty, but when that glove came off, the truth was stained in soot, sweat, and scent. She carried pomanders, small decorative balls filled with scented herbs or sponge soaked in vinegar, dangling from her belt or tucked in her sleeve. These were thought to block miasmas. In reality, they served as personal air fresheners in a world without baths. In court portraits, these items are visible as symbols of wealth, but they were also symbols of fear, of desperation, of a queen who knew her body was betraying her and who fought back not with cleanliness, but with chemistry. Her approach to hygiene became increasingly ritualistic. Before major ceremonies, rooms were filled with incense, garments were stored with herbs, and the queen would sit for hours, being dusted, perfumed, patted, and masked, not to feel beautiful, but to hide the breaking beneath. In one rare private letter, a lady-in-waiting described the queen's chambers after a long summer banquet. Her Majesty's linen gave off a bitter musk, and her seat was wet through, though she bore it all with grace and silence. That sentence, though subtle, captures the heartbreak of it all, the silence, the dignity, the filth. Because Elizabeth knew she could never be ordinary, she could never admit to sweat, never flinch at her own stench, never scratch the lice that crawled under her crown. She was more than mortal. She was a nation, and nations do not bleed. They do not itch. They do not rot. But she did, and so she buried it beneath crushed jewels and chemical smoke. Her body became the battlefield, her perfume the last defense, and in those layers of pearl dust and ash, a queen disappeared, replaced by a ghost that still wore the crown, even as her flesh faded beneath it. By the final decade of Queen Elizabeth I's life, her body was a shrine to denial, a monarchy of powder, perfume, and pain. She cloaked infection in brocade. She silenced bleeding gums with cloves. She crushed pearls into ash and called it grace. But no disguise, no scent, no ritual of nobility could cover the truth of where she spent her darkest hours. The royal bed, draped in embroidered silk, ringed with velvet curtains, towering over her chamber like a cathedral of power. Elizabeth's bed was the most private and sacred object in her life, and yet it was also the filthiest, because for all her regal glory, Queen Elizabeth I slept each night in a nest of rot, a bed that was never properly washed, a bed she shared with lice, mites, fleas, and animals. To the Tudor mind, the bed was not a hygienic space. It was a space of symbolic power, ritual, and inherited status. The Queen's bed was an heirloom passed through generations, layered in history, not hygiene. Its mattress was stuffed with feathers and straw, wrapped in linen that was rarely changed. The bedding absorbed night sweats, powders, body oils, and menstrual blood, but it was only cleaned if stained. Even then, it was spot-treated, not washed. The fabric was too delicate, the embroidery too expensive. Sheets were often aired, not laundered. Blankets were perfumed, not scrubbed. And as her body decayed, the bed absorbed everything she gave it. Her back sores would seep into the fabric. Her powdered wigs would shed into the pillows. Her infected skin would flake onto the linen, which her servants folded again the next morning and tucked into place as if it were holy. And in that holy rot, small invaders made their home. Bedbugs and lice were common even in noble homes. In royal homes, they were constant. Elizabeth's bed canopy, stuffed with warmth and never cleaned, was a paradise for them. Night after night, the queen would lie motionless beneath her gilded sheets as insects crawled across her scalp, into her clothing, and across her blistered skin. But she never showed it, because discomfort was never acknowledged in court. Pain was not confessed. Even her own attendants, while applying perfumes and powders each morning, would simply shake out the pillows and move on, knowing full well that the same pillow had soaked in blood the night before. And Elizabeth did not sleep alone. She had a deep affection for small animals, particularly lapdogs and birds. Some historians suggest she allowed her pets into bed with her, especially during colder months. These animals, while beloved, were not bathed. They carried fleas, ticks, and waste onto the same sheets that touched the queen's skin. One court account describes a dog licking at the queen's fingers during a morning dressing. Another describes a feathered companion sleeping by Her Majesty's head. The presence of animals in her bed was not shocking by Tudor standards. It was viewed as warmth, comfort, even nobility. But by modern standards, it created a closed ecosystem of parasites, disease, and filth. The bed curtains, heavy velvet panels meant to preserve warmth and privacy, also trapped air. Combined with the rush mat flooring, the perfumed powders, and the sweat-drenched sheets, the chamber became a furnace of bacteria. The air was thick, the stench dense and sweet. Some foreign diplomats requested outdoor meetings rather than risk long visits in the queen's chambers. Even her own courtiers sometimes faked illness to avoid spending nights near her rooms. Yet none of this was documented in shame. The bed, after all, was sacred. In a world without privacy, Elizabeth's bed was one of the few spaces where she held full control, and she guarded it fiercely. In her later years, she refused to allow physicians into the chamber without written permission. She slept in a sitting position, fully clothed, surrounded by relics and dried flowers, afraid of what the night might reveal. One lady-in-waiting recorded that she lay in darkness most days, fearing sleep, fearing light, fearing the mirror. The bed became a throne of secrets, a place where pain could be hidden, a place where illness could be denied, and a place where hygiene, or the lack of it, could be buried beneath the silk. The parasites in her bed did not care for rank. They fed as lice do, equally. And Elizabeth, who ruled over empires, who silenced popes and suitors alike, could not silence them. The scratching continued, the sores deepened, the stench spread, and still, each morning the bed was folded, the sheets were powdered, the pets were kissed, the lies continued. In death, the bed was stripped. Some historians believe the mattress was burned. Others suggest it was stored, with lice still hidden deep within the seams. Either way, the queen who once ruled with unmatched brilliance was buried without ever truly having known rest. Her bed was not a refuge. It was a prison, a slow, fragrant tomb, a place where no water ever touched, no soap ever reached, no truth was ever spoken, and she would rather rot inside it than let the world know she was mortal. The bed had become her final stage, the powdered sheets her last disguise. Every night was a silent battle against the crawling parasites that fed on her skin, and every morning she rose wrapped in sweat and silk, her attendants layering perfume and paint over the wounds they dared not name. But the most haunting of all Queen Elizabeth II's final rituals wasn't what she did to hide the decay. It was what she refused to see. In her last years, the Queen ordered all mirrors removed from her presence, not covered, not turned to the wall, removed, banished, erased, because the one thing she could not conquer, could not powder over, could not drown in rose oil, was the truth of her own reflection. She had spent a lifetime crafting an image, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the eternal empress of an empire that touched every sea. Her face was currency, her portraits, propaganda, her hairline, raised artificially to elongate her forehead, was considered divine. Her skin, painted white with lead paste, was hailed as otherworldly. Her appearance was not a detail, it was the monarchy itself. But as the years progressed, and the poison sank deeper, and the flesh gave way, the illusion cracked. Beneath the powder, her skin blistered and collapsed. The lead makeup she had worn daily for decades created deep fissures and ulcers. Her once expressive eyes sank into black hollows, her jaw, distorted by tooth loss and infection, no longer aligned. In private moments, attendants whispered of her drawn countenance and sunken visage. What had once been glorified as angelic had begun to resemble a corpse. Still, her image in public had to be maintained. State artists were forbidden to paint her true likeness. Instead, they were instructed to use a mask of youth, a standardized face used for all official portraits, regardless of the queen's real appearance. No matter her actual condition, the portraits showed her eternally 30, pale, pristine, untouchable. But that mask could not be applied to the mirror. And when Elizabeth accidentally caught sight of her own reflection, perhaps in a basin of water, a polished metal buckle, or a moment of inattentive preparation, the reaction was reportedly one of silent horror. She would fall into long silences, refuse to speak. Sometimes she would stare into nothing for hours, lost in a trance of denial. The fear was not just of aging, it was deeper. It was the fear that she no longer existed, that the myth had outlived the woman, that what stared back was not Gloriana, but something hollow, something beyond her control. And so, she ordered the mirrors removed, from her chambers, from her dressing rooms, even from her private garden, where water reflections might betray her. What remained were walls of scent and sound, perfumes, poetry, advisors reciting old victories, all designed to echo the Elizabeth she once was, not the one she had become. Her attendants were instructed to maintain the illusion at all times. They spoke only of her beauty, even as they dabbed powder into bleeding sores. They complimented her elegance, even as they adjusted the corsets to hold in swelling. They greeted her with smiles, even as they caught glimpses of the fungal infections along her scalp or the deep lines where her face no longer held its shape. Any sign of discomfort was forbidden. Any confession of pain, a betrayal. And so, the court became complicit in her denial. The Queen of England, once sharp, witty, and unflinchingly aware of her enemies, now lived in a fortress of curated flattery. Even her doctors lied. When she asked if her health was fading, they reassured her with poems and flattery. When she questioned her appearance, they blamed the candlelight or the angle of the sun. But the truth was everywhere. It was in the way her feet no longer fit her favorite shoes, in the way her corset left purple bruises where the flesh had thinned, in the way her eyes watered uncontrollably, her vision clouded not just by age, but by the accumulation of chemicals she'd used to chase away mortality. Still, she insisted, no mirrors, no truth, no confrontation. In her final winter, Elizabeth stopped sleeping entirely. She stood for hours, refusing to lie down, refusing to undress, afraid that if she did, if she removed the garments, the powder, the paste, the woman underneath would dissolve into the cold air. She had become so bound to the image that she could not afford to see the reality. The myth had to be preserved at all costs, even if it meant losing touch with the person she once was. When she finally fell into what would become her last sickness, a slow, lingering decline, she continued to refuse mirrors. She requested that her chamber be lit only by firelight. She allowed no male physicians to. examine her. Her ladies kept their gazes low. When the end came, it was quiet. She passed not as a warrior or a saint, but as a woman buried beneath layers of silk, powders, oils, and lies, so many that no one truly knew what part of her was still real. The woman who once said, "Though the sex to which I belong is considered weak, you will nevertheless find me a rock that bends to no wind," died unable to face her own eyes. The mirror was her final enemy, and she chose never to look. In that choice, Elizabeth revealed the most disturbing truth of all, that even the strongest rulers, the most powerful symbols, the eternal icons of history are still human underneath. And when the mask begins to slip, some would rather go blind than admit what's underneath. The mirror was gone, but the body remained, fragile, blistered, powdered into silence. The queen had rejected her own reflection, denied sleep, and disguised illness with silks and scent. But if her skin told one story of rot, her appetite told another, because while Elizabeth's face was painted with poisons and her body bound in unwashed cloth, the corruption went even deeper. It reached her stomach, for beneath the lace-trimmed banquets and gold-plated goblets lay another horror, the royal table itself. A place where food was rarely fresh, water was rarely clean, and nearly every bite brought her closer to the grave. And still, she called it dining. To be royal in Tudor England was to eat not for health, but for spectacle. Every meal was a declaration of wealth, superiority, and divine favor. It wasn't about sustenance. It was about size, sweetness, and slaughter. Elizabeth's court consumed massive quantities of red meat, heavy breads, spiced pies, candied fruits, and sweetened wines. Fresh vegetables were considered peasant food, too moist for the elite. Water was avoided, as it was often contaminated, and milk was for children or servants. The queen's meals were served in pewter dishes, lead-glazed pottery, and gilded goblets, many of which leached dangerous metals into the food over time. Lead poisoning, mercury traces, and arsenic residue were unknowingly part of the royal diet. The kitchen conditions were no better. Elizabeth's palaces, though luxurious in their halls, lacked refrigeration, proper ventilation, or pest control. Meat was stored in open-air pantries, salted for preservation, but often hung for days, sometimes weeks, developing mold before being trimmed and served. The stench was hidden with spices, cloves, cinnamon, pepper. Moldy crusts were soaked in wine. Fish was dried or pickled until unrecognizable. And the queen, like everyone else, believed this was normal. In fact, she believed it was elite. She loved sweet pies stuffed with dates, venison, and hard-boiled eggs, often topped with sugar crusts that had to be broken with a spoon. She drank sack wine, a sweet oxidized drink high in alcohol and acidity. Her sweet tooth, already destructive to her teeth, became another invitation for decay. These indulgences, eaten daily, put enormous strain on her body, especially her digestion. Elizabeth was known to suffer from colic, wind, and gripping of the belly, all Tudor terms for intense gastrointestinal distress. But rather than reduce sugar or meat, she turned to herbal tonics, mixtures of rhubarb, wormwood, and wine. These remedies often contained toxic levels of mercury or antimony intended to purge the system violently, and purge they did. It's believed she suffered from chronic constipation and irregular bowel movements, often worsened by the lack of fiber and hydration in her diet. But the court saw this not as a dietary problem, but a spiritual one. A queen in pain was a queen under divine testing. So rather than change the menu, they changed the prayers. In her final decade, Elizabeth's appetite shrank. She ate less frequently, but still insisted on grand displays. Even when ill, even when her teeth were too rotten to chew, she sat before tables of food that spanned entire chambers, not to eat, but to be seen. And what she did eat, She swallowed slowly, often cutting meat into tiny pieces to avoid pain. Some reports suggest that her attendants began chewing food for her discreetly or preparing softened dishes in private. One dish she favored was a thick broth made from boiled veal, herbs, and almond milk, sweetened with honey, served lukewarm to spare her gums. Even these gentle foods, however, were not free of danger. The pots they were cooked in were unlined copper. The cups, lead-glazed earthenware. Over time, the accumulated metal exposure may have contributed to her neurological decline. Tremors, memory lapses, mood swings, and paranoia. And yet, no one linked food to illness. There was no concept of bacteria, no understanding of cross-contamination. Kitchen scraps were sometimes reused, meat handled without hand washing, and rats were common in storage areas. At one palace, a visiting noble wrote of an odor most foul from the lower halls, likely referring to the rot of the larders. And above that, on a throne of gold, the queen took her meal. Her desserts, though beautiful, were equally deadly. Marzipan molded into castles, sugar sculptures of mythic beasts, and dried fruits laced with rosewater were served as art more than food. But Elizabeth adored them. She once requested a dish of candied violets, so sweetened with honey that the petals hardened like glass. These treats stuck to her remaining teeth, fed the infection in her gums, and aggravated her. Already failing digestion, and still, she smiled through them, or tried. In one infamous event, a visiting ambassador offered her a toast, and the queen lifted a goblet of sweet wine, smiled politely, then winced so sharply it was later whispered that one of her teeth had cracked in the act. That night she refused supper, but the next morning the sugar returned, because for Elizabeth, food, like everything else, was not about health. It was about image. Her diet was theatrical. Her meals, performances. No matter how much her stomach churned, how much her gums bled, how many nights she spent in pain, she never publicly altered the menu. And no one dared suggest she should. The Queen of England could not be seen nibbling broth and boiled roots. She had to feast, even if every bite brought her closer to death. And so, in her palace of powder, in her bed of insects, with her mirror banished and her nerves poisoned, she dined on decay with royal grace and never looked back. Her teeth had crumbled, her skin had cracked, her hair was gone, her eyes, once sharp and commanding, had faded into the deep-set shadows of exhaustion and silent terror. Her meals poisoned her, her bed was a nest of insects, her body reeked beneath the perfume, and her reflection had long been outlawed from her sight. But for Queen Elizabeth I, the performance could never end, not even in death, because when the Virgin Queen finally breathed her last in the early hours of March 24th, 1603, she was not allowed to decay like a mortal woman. She was prepared like a relic, embalmed not with reverence, but with stagecraft. Her final hygiene ritual, the last in a lifetime of denial and illusion, was to be painted, powdered, and perfumed one last time so that even her corpse could not betray her legend. Those who attended her in her final days described a monarch who refused to lie down, who stood for hours in silence, her body trembling, her breath shallow, her eyes fixed on nothing. She would not remove her robes. She would not allow anyone to see her without her makeup, even then. And when death came at last, she was not found peacefully tucked into a clean bed. She was found sitting, rigid, cloaked in the same gown she had worn for days, her skin taut and graying beneath cracked layers of old ceruse and pearl dust. Her body was swollen, her limbs stiff. The room smelled not of death, but of decaying perfume, the kind that lingers too long, like flowers left in water for weeks. The rituals began almost immediately, but not the rituals of mourning, the rituals of concealment. Elizabeth's body, though already entering the early stages of decomposition, was deemed too sacred, too symbolic, too royal to be seen in any state that suggested she had ever been human. And so, her attendants set to work transforming her one last time. They did not wash the body in the traditional sense. They dabbed the skin with rosewater and alcohol, not to clean, but to slow the odor. The face was repainted with a fresh layer of white paste, even though the skin underneath had already begun to separate. Crushed pearls were dusted across her cheeks. Her lips were tinted red with powdered cochineal and rosewax. Her eyes, sunken and dull, were left closed, her lashes darkened with soot and oil. Around her, the room was flooded with incense and dried herbs. The windows were sealed. The mirrors, already banished in life, remained absent in death. Her nails were cleaned. Her hands, swollen from years of arthritis and possibly infection, were gloved in lace. Her final gown was layered in silk and ermine, and atop her head, a wig of red gold curls, styled high, powdered stiff, covering the scalp that had long since bled dry. This was not embalming. This was stage makeup for a corpse, and all of it, every dab of powder, every sprig of rosemary, every silk ribbon stitched into her dress, was done with one goal: to make her look eternal. Her body was placed in a lead-lined coffin, sealed quickly, not just to protect the Queen's dignity, but because the odor had already begun to swell. The lead casket slowed decomposition, but only barely. The air within began to rot. Her attendants noted that flowers placed inside wilted faster than normal. Her funeral procession took place weeks later, and when the coffin was lifted and carried through the streets of London, no one saw the woman inside, only the symbol painted atop it, a wax figure of Elizabeth, mounted on the casket, posed in full regalia. This effigy, a painted replica made of wood and wax, showed a glowing face, flawless skin, and eyes that gazed forward as if eternity had no power over her. But inside the box, the real Elizabeth had already begun to dissolve. Her body, long denied water, had become brittle. Her skin, once layered in poisons to preserve appearance, now collapsed faster under their chemical weight. The same white paste that masked her flaws in life now cracked open her flesh in death. But no one spoke of it. The crowd mourned the myth. The Queen was dead. Long live the image. And in that final moment, Elizabeth became what she had always feared: a shell, a construct, a hollow echo of her own invention. Not because she had no legacy, but because she had refused, to her final breath, to be seen as mortal. The woman who had ruled through war, survived assassination plots, crushed empires, and transformed England into a global power, left behind a corpse, dressed for a performance that would never end. Her tomb was placed in Westminster Abbey, beneath a sculpture of her youthful face, holding the orb and scepter. Tourists and kings would visit, bowing before her marble effigy, but they would never know what truly lay beneath: the powdered flesh, the perfumed rot, the quiet horror of a life so devoted to image that even death had to wear a mask. And in that sealed silence, in the scentless darkness of royal decay, the final lie lingered, perfectly powdered, perfectly posed, perfectly untouchable. She was gone, sealed beneath marble and myths, embalmed not with truth, but with ceremony. The stench was buried with her. The sores, the rot, the lice, the powder vanished from memory as quickly as the candles were snuffed after her funeral. But Queen Elizabeth I, even in death, was not allowed to decay, not in story, not in statecraft, not in the hearts of the people who had never seen the blood behind her gloves, because history, like her servants, went to work immediately, cleaning up the corpse, not with water, but with words. They wrote books, poems, and epics that described her beauty as immortal, her mind as divine, and her reign as one of unmatched glory. Her hygiene was not omitted, it was inverted. Writers praised her radiant complexion, her lily-white hands, her golden hair, and unblemished grace. Foreign ambassadors who had once gagged behind scented gloves now wrote posthumous tributes that likened her to goddesses. The ulcers were gone, the blackened teeth erased, the stifling bed with its crawling seams disappeared beneath lines of prose describing celestial dreams and royal dignity. The real Elizabeth, the woman who had not bathed in weeks, who bled into her corsets, who flinched at her own reflection, was replaced by a wax figure of history's choosing, one with skin like marble and scent like roses. It was no accident. England needed her to be clean. The Virgin Queen had become a myth of national identity. She was the protector against Rome, the defeater of the Spanish Armada, the patron of poets, the unifier of a fractured land. Her filth did not fit, the truth would not hold, and so it was rewritten. Court records that described her skin conditions, her refusal to wash, her decaying teeth, they were lost or buried. Later historians, working from royal archives cleansed by loyal hands, assumed the Queen's beauty was as pure as her reputation. Those few who whispered otherwise were dismissed as enemies, liars, or foreign agents. Even portraits were restored over time, faces brightened, skin tones lightened, shadows erased. The wrinkles that marked a lifetime of suffering were smoothed by the stroke of a painter's brush. Her image was immortalized in coin and marble. The powdered corpse became a crowned marble statue, and England bowed before it. School children memorized her speeches. Playwrights romanticized her presence. The symbol of Elizabeth became so powerful that it no longer required truth. The cleanliness of her legacy became a mirror opposite of the stench of her life, and no one questioned it, because people prefer saints to sovereigns. They prefer cleanliness to complexity, and so her powder was transformed into purity, her silence into strength, her decay into divinity. But beneath every modern retelling, the truth still twitches, in letters locked away, in descriptions from foreign visitors who gasped at the smell of her chamber, in the stories passed between servants who held the cloth to her skin and saw what lay beneath. They knew, and they were silenced, because history is not about what happened, it's about what is allowed to remain. And Elizabeth's story was not just preserved, it was purified. In that purification, we lost something vital. We lost the human beneath the crown. We lost the woman who bled from her mouth but still gave speeches, who scratched through her wigs and still stood tall, who sweated beneath 6 layers of velvet and still ruled the world. Her strength was not in her illusion, it was in her endurance. But we erased that and gave her perfection instead. In doing so, we made her something she never truly was: clean. It is only now, centuries later, with the cold distance of time and the curiosity of truth seekers, that her filth begins to resurface, not to shame her, but to free her. Because in understanding how she lived, how she suffered, how she rotted beneath the crown she carried, we begin to understand just how much she bore and how much she hid, not just from the world, but from herself. The marble statue stands, the portraits still hang, the coins still shimmer with her idealized face, but beneath all of it, beneath the crown, beneath the velvet, beneath the makeup that cracked like plaster over a corpse, is the real legacy, Queen Elizabeth I left behind. Not purity, not perfection, not even power, but something far more haunting, something far more human. Because what makes her story endure isn't how beautiful she looked, or how flawlessly she ruled, or how pure her image was. It's how much filth she carried and how hard she tried to hide it. The history of Elizabeth I is not just a record of conquests and courtships, it's a lesson in denial, a study in what happens when a person is so bound to the myth of themselves that they stop cleaning the body underneath. Her filth wasn't an accident, it was her shield, her armor, her refusal to bathe, her layers of powder, her unwashed bed, her rot-covered skin. They were all acts of resistance, because to clean herself was to confront herself, and that she would never do. That's why her filth matters, because it's the most honest thing she ever wore. While men wrote sonnets about her eyes and coins bore her smile, lice crawled through her crown and blood pooled beneath her corset. She smiled through abscesses. She waved with rotting fingers. She ruled with her stomach full of spoiled meat and her lungs breathing incense to mask the smell of decay. That wasn't failure. That was strength. Brutal, tragic, almost unimaginable strength. She never let them see her crack. Never let them see her wince. Even when her mirror was gone and her face sagged beneath makeup applied over broken skin, she remained upright, composed, commanding. And in that, she outlived every suitor who mocked her, every assassin who targeted her, every priest who prayed for her collapse. Her reign did not last because of divine purity. It lasted because she refused to admit the pain, and maybe that's what made her the most powerful ruler of her time. But it's also what made her the loneliest. The smell of her court was not just perfume and sweat. It was the odor of a woman buried alive in expectations. A woman denied permission to bleed, to age, to be touched, to be seen. And maybe that's what power is, at its most grotesque. The ability to rot in peace and still be applauded for your glow. The irony is cruel. The same empire that hid her stench to preserve the myth also erased the cost of that myth. The same artist who painted her skin white washed away her suffering. But now, centuries later, when we strip away the powder, when we open the bed curtains, when we stand where the mirrors once were, we begin to see her again. Not Gloriana, not the Virgin Queen, but Elizabeth, a woman in pain, a woman with grit and terror in equal measure, a woman who would rather die in silk and powder than be seen undone. Her filth is not a footnote, it's the story, because no one hides that hard unless they're afraid to be known, and no one is that afraid unless they know the cost of being seen. So we remember her not because she was flawless, but because she was so desperately human, and because she built an empire on the illusion that she wasn't. And in that illusion, we find the truest reflection of power, a cracked mirror turned to the wall in a room that smells like roses and sweat, where a queen once stood tall and quietly fell apart.